Once upon a time, there was an old woman living on an island. And she hadn't always lived on that island. Her boat that she was on many years ago had shipwrecked on the shores. And it was a remote island. And she tried for many years to get off, to light fires, to send distress signals, but she was marooned on a deserted island. And luckily, she was a very resourceful woman, and her name was Florence. And Florence's dad had been a military man and had trained her as a young girl for all sorts of situations. She grew up, very athletic. She could always do more pull-ups than any of the boys in class. She knew how to start a fire with just whatever was laying around. And so she was actually the perfect person to be stuck on this island. So she managed to survive. And she had been on this island for about 10 years now. And she had free time, right? She was able to hunt and gather, and the island provided everything she needed to survive. But she had some downtime and she was bored. And so she started to construct a rope just out of pure boredom. She took fibers from the coconut trees and she would just start weaving this rope every day for just like a half hour a day. Bit by bit, this rope would grow and grow. She had been weaving this rope for the last 5 years. And one particular day, a storm came. And so she had to fortify her little hut that she had built. And so she left her rope weaving duties. She tied what she had to a coconut tree because she didn't want that rope to blow away in the storm. So she tied it up, she fortified her hut. She came inside with her pet squirrel. She had befriended a little squirrel named Timothy. And Timothy and Florence were best friends. They were thick as thieves, as they say. They would have all their meals together. He would bring her, various acorns and nuts from the island, and she would feed him whatever else they could find. And they had a really great relationship. So her little buddy Timothy, the squirrel, and Florence ran inside as the storm was approaching. And then something strange happened.
The storm was great and terrible, shaking the walls of the hut. Thunder rumbled, lightning flashed, winds howled. The seas grew angry and sloshed up against the shore. Florence was very scared, but she had Timothy, and together they huddled into the hut and crawled under the blanket and covered their heads, and they stayed safe and warm while the storm raged. And then, in the morning, the storm broke and the sun came out. And they went out to survey the damage and found that the island had been ravaged by the angry storm, but was still in good shape, and the trees were all still standing, and leaves were strewn about, but nothing they couldn't clean up and make beautiful again. But the rope she had tied to a tree was now leading out to sea. And she loved her rope. She had, it had been her hobby for so long, so she went over to try to pull it back in. But as she pulled, the rope was taut and wouldn't pull in, as if something else were pulling back on the other side. And she didn't know what to do, and she looked at Timothy, and Timothy seemed to know what to do, so Timothy ran out and ran on the rope. The rope was so taut that he could easily tightrope across it, and he ran out, disappearing on the horizon. And Florence waited. She waited, and she cleaned up the beach and cleaned up all the debris and the various fronds and coconuts that had fallen. But Timothy didn't come back. She began to call out to the sea, "Timothy, Timothy, come back. Timothy, where are you?" But Timothy didn't come back. And so Florence realized there was only one thing to do. She needed to go walk along that rope and find her friend Timothy. And so she stepped onto the rope and found that it was pulled taut enough to support her weight, and she began walking out into sea before she too disappeared upon the horizon.
And what happened was, when she got to the end of that rope, she got sucked underwater. But it was as if she had water all around her, but she wasn't actually in the water. It was a giant whirlpool, and she was sucked beneath the surface, surrounded by water, but still she could breathe. There was air around her, water on all sides, and she twisted and turned and spun around. And in the spinning, she saw Timothy spinning around as well. It was like the tornado in The Wizard of Oz, except underwater. And they spun and spun and spun, and then finally got sucked all the way down into blackness. And then suddenly she opened her eyes, and she was on the shore of a different island. Timothy right by her side. They were both a little wet. They were both a little scared. They had been through some heavy stuff. It was a little bit of a traumatic experience, but they were okay. She had no broken bones, no bruises. He was good. They checked each other, and they looked around on this island. And there were other huts. This island had people living on it. And at first she was frightened because she had not been around people for probably 10 years now. And she'd given up on trying to get out. She was just making this rope just to pass the time. But this rope somehow had connected her and Timothy to another island, and it was vibrant. There were huts everywhere, and there was music playing. And she didn't see anybody at first, but then suddenly she saw a few of the villagers exit their huts to see what had washed up. They didn't really make much of a noise when they washed up, but I guess these villagers were used to things washing up, and so they would always check the shores. And so they saw Timothy, they saw Florence, and there was music in the background. And so they had arrived at a party. And at first, these villagers did not know what to make of Florence and Timothy because they had never seen an outsider before. And so after they got through the initial shock of this new person arriving on their shore, they approached her very carefully and they spoke to her.
And they said, "Hello, who are you?" And Florence said, "I'm Florence, and this is Timothy." "Well, where did you come from?" And she points out to the sea and says, "I came from the sea. I was on an island all my own with Timothy, and there was a terrible storm. And, well, one thing led to another. We ended up in a whirlpool, and we're here." And they said, "Oh, well, are you going to go back?" And she goes, "Well, I don't know how to get back. How do I get back? How do you get off the island?" And they're like, "You don't get off the island. We live here on the island. The island provides everything we need." And then she's like, "Well, I kind of want to go home." "Well, we're very sorry. We don't know how to do that." And she goes, "Well, can I stay here with you?" And they look at each other and they don't really know what to do. This is the first person who's ever washed up on shore. Are they supposed to take this person in? They're very friendly and kind people. And they go, "Well, certainly, but everybody here does something. Everybody here has a special talent and skill. We have Jorge over here. He plays the guitar very beautifully. And we have Janine, and she plays the drums. We have Luke, who plays the flute. We have our friend Tony over here. He is a great fisherman, and he provides fish. We have Jeremy, who climbs the trees, and he gets coconuts. Nobody climbs trees like Jeremy. What do you do?" And Florence thinks, and she's like, "Well, I don't know. I mean, I've been on my own for a while. I can climb trees." "Well, can you climb trees as good as Jeremy?" And she's like, "Well, I don't know." And, "Well, let's see." Jeremy goes and climbs a tree very quickly, and Florence is like, "Oh, I can't climb like that. He's so good at that. It's not me." "Well, do you play an instrument?" And she's like, No, I could learn." It's like, "Well, yeah, you could learn, but, what can you do?" And she looks at Timothy, and Timothy chitters, and Timothy runs over to the tree and pulls off several fronds and strings and, starts pulling stuff off and brings it over and hands it to Florence. And Florence looks down at Timothy and goes, "Oh, well, I'm very good at making rope." And they go, "You can make rope? No one here can make rope. That's amazing. Would you come and join us and be our rope maker?" And Florence looked at Timothy, and Timothy chittered, and they both nodded, and they both said, okay, yes, we would love to make your rope. And the mayor of the village proclaims, everyone, come meet Florence. She's a new member of our village. This is Florence and this is Timothy, and they make our rope. And the village cheered, and they settled in, and in a day they built her own hut. And that night, Timothy and Florence cuddled up together under a blanket, and there was no storm, and everything was peaceful, and they had everything they had before, only now they had friends, and they had a purpose. And together, they worked together to make all the rope for that village for all the rest of their days. The end. Once upon a time, there was a little boy, and that little boy loved to ride his bike, and he loved to go out and explore. He especially loved exploring the nearby woods near his house, where he had all sorts of wonderful adventures. There was all these great hills and dense trees. He would go in certain parts of it were so densely packed with trees that it was nice and dark and created all the backdrop for all of his great daydreams. He would go in there and he'd play. It was full of perfect sticks that would represent anything from magical staves to guns to things that he could build into forts. He could do everything that he ever wanted in this forest, and he loved it. But his parents would never, ever let him go out after sunset. Because after sunset, they said, the wolves come out, and that they would hear howling out in the woods. And so they'd never let him out. And one night, he grew so bored in his house. He didn't like playing video games. He didn't like watching television. He liked playing in his imagination in the woods. And that night he was so bored, he decided to sneak out and go investigate the woods. And so he secretly took his bike and he biked away very quietly off down the street and off past the road closed sign at the end of the dead end that led into the woods where he would explore. And he went in and he found it even darker than he'd ever seen it before. And it was so dark, could barely see, but he knew his way because he had played here so often. He knew every path, he knew every crook, he knew every critter that lived in the woods. He had names for them all. They didn't talk to him, but he talked to them. And as he would go through in the woods, he found himself starting to get a little scared and a little worried because he knew these woods so well, but he started to realize maybe mom and dad were right. Maybe I shouldn't be out here. They keep hearing wolves here at night. And he wandered deeper and deeper and started to have second thoughts. Should I be out here at all? Maybe I should have listened to mom and dad. And he hears creaks as the wind blows through the boughs, and he hears the breaking of twigs and branches as the nighttime nocturnal animals come out to scurry. And he doesn't know these animals. He doesn't know them by name. He's never seen them before. But they rustle leaves, they break twigs, and he's starting to get very nervous. And he decides to go to this clearing that he knows of, where there's no trees overhead. And it's just this nice open round area where he can go and be in a little light. And as he steps into the clearing, he looks up. And the next thing he knows, he wakes up in bed. And it's the next morning. He's just been gone. He remembered being in the woods. He remembered stepping into the brightly lit clearing. But he doesn't know why. He's here at home. And he goes outside and checks for his bike, and his bike's still there. And he thinks maybe this was a dream. Maybe he dreamed going out into the woods that night. So the next night, he goes out and he sneaks out and he does it again. And he goes to the woods and he used to find this clearing, and he steps into the clearing and nothing happens. He doesn't end up back in bed. He's just in the clearing. He looks up and the moon is bright but not quite full. And then he starts to wonder, wait a second, the moon is not full. The moon was full last night. Am I the wolf? Am I the werewolf? He doesn't know. And he starts to wonder. And so every day from then on, he starts to wonder, is he the werewolf? And so he waits and he starts counting the days and the phases of the moon. and he just starts tracking it along the calendar. And the day of the full moon, he grows very excited and scared, because what if he's the werewolf? And so that night, he sneaks out and he looks up, but the sky is full of clouds. He can't see the moon, so he doesn't know. And he's like, well, he's going to go out and he's going to go back into those woods again. And he goes out, he bikes out into the woods, and he goes through the dark forest, and he's not so scared anymore, because he starts to wonder if he's what he should be scared of. Should he be scared of himself if he's the werewolf? And as he's walking through, he sees small shafts of light coming through the trees because the clouds have clearly burned off. And he goes towards the clearing, and he sees it's brightly lit with moonlight. And he steps in, and he begins to howl. And then he wakes up the next morning in his bed, and he realizes what's really going on. He's the werewolf, but he's concerned because he knows that werewolves are dangerous. That werewolves, they're scary. They kill people. They hurt people. So instantly he does what he normally doesn't do. He goes out to breakfast with his father, and he grabs the newspaper and starts reading the newspaper. And his dad looks at him a little strangely because, his son never comes out and reads the newspaper. But he's reading the newspaper, and he's going through and he's looking for any horrible things that happened. But nothing horrible happened. So what did he do last night? What happened after he hit the moonlight? And so he's very, very concerned, but wondering, what am I doing? What is going on? So once again, he starts counting the phases of the moon and counting down the days to 28 days later when the moon is going to be full one more time. But this time, he borrows his father's video camera, and he takes the video camera out with him. And he takes the camera out, and he sets it up near the clearing, and he waits for the moon to come out from behind the clouds. And as the clearing brightens, he realizes it's his time, and he steps out into the moonlight, and he begins to howl, and fur comes out of his arms and his legs and his cheeks, and he gets whiskers, and he grows a big long snout, and and then he wakes up the next morning in his bed, and once again his bike is back where it should be, and the video camera is back where it belongs. And he waits for his mom and dad to go to work, and then he goes and he takes the video camera and he plugs it into the television, and he just watches. And he sees himself walk slowly into the moonlight. He watches himself transform and change into this big, large, hairy werewolf. And then he gets down on all fours and he howls. And then out of the corner of the screen, he sees 4 other wolves traipse in and howl back at him. And the 5 of them begin playing and enjoying the night and dancing in the moonlight together and having a great time. And they run off into the woods, and they go off to gallivant in the woods together. And the video keeps recording, and he fast forward and he fast forward, and he comes back, and then he starts to see as the moon gets covered up by the clouds, and he turns back into a little boy, and the 4 other wolves turn into other little boys and girls, and they all grab their things and go back home, to go back into bed, to wait to play for 28 more days. The end.
Once upon a time, there was an elderly woman named Catherine. And Catherine, she wasn't the healthiest eater, and most people that knew her were surprised that she had lived this long and lived a good life, because she would eat a lot of candy. She still had all her teeth somehow. She was like the Keith Richards of the neighborhood. And kids, I don't know if you know who Keith Richards is, but he is still alive, and many are surprised by that given his habits in life. But, she didn't smoke, she didn't drink, but she just didn't eat well. And the one thing that she always liked to eat or chew was bubblegum. And she sort of became famous for this because she could blow the biggest bubbles that anyone had ever seen. And luckily for her, she lived in an area that had bubble blowing contests every year. At the state fair, they would, they'd bring out the cows, they'd bring out the pigs, and all the farmers would show their livestock, and they'd have competitions to see who had the best cow, the best pig, and all of that. And they would have some hot dog eating contests. They would have some juggling contests. They would have a strong person contest where you'd have to pick up a hammer and ring the bell kind of thing, that they have at these fairs. I'm not sure what that's called, but anyway, they also had a gum chewing and bubble blowing competition. And every year since Catherine was a child, she would enter. And every year she would win. No one had beaten Catherine. And it got to the point, too. I mean, she was in her 80s now. There were some really strong gum chewers in the region who would come in for this, and they would think that they could dethrone Catherine. But every year, she wiped the floor with them. Every year, she blew the biggest bubbles. And no one knew really what her secret was. Well, one year at the fair, there was a little girl named Susie. And Susie loved chewing gum also, and she was fascinated by this bubble blowing contest. And she would practice herself, but she was never very good. Well, one year she got up the courage to approach Catherine and ask her what her secret was.
And Catherine said she has a couple of secrets. Her first secret is that she chews more than one piece at a time, which allows her to get extra huge bubbles. And over time, she's been working her jaw, and so her jaw can really accommodate this. And so she blows these extra huge bubbles with multiple pieces of gum, as many as she can fit in her mouth. And her second secret is right before she goes up to blow the bubble, she takes one breath of helium from a helium balloon. And she might be talking high-pitched like this for a little bit, but she breathes in helium, and then that's what she breathes into the bubble, because it's going to expand outward and outward. And the little girl Susie says, okay, this year, I think that you should blow the biggest bubble ever. I want you to show this town the biggest bubble you can ever blow. You've been doing this for decades. Outdo yourself. And Catherine decides that the gauntlet has been thrown. So she gets up there at the podium and she shoves 10 pieces of bubble gum in her mouth. More bubble gum than can fit in any human mouth. And it's so hard to chew, but she's figuring it out, and she's chewing and chewing and chewing. And she grabs a balloon off the podium and she takes a breath in, and then she starts blowing and blowing and blowing. And the bubble gets huge, and she keeps blowing and blowing and blowing and blowing, and it gets massive until it's the size of the stage, and then her feet start lifting off the ground. And the bubble starts floating upward. But Catherine can't let go. This is her moment. This is the moment of her life. This is her championship. And she starts floating upward with a bubble coming out of her mouth, and she's still blowing into it. And now she doesn't know what to do, but she's breathing through her nose. So she keeps putting more air into it. And suddenly she's in the clouds. And everyone down at the county fair is just seeing her float away as she's going up, up, up. And next thing she knows, she's passing birds, and the birds are like, what is that? And she's waving at them. And then next thing you know, she's going even higher, and she's seeing weather balloons, and she's seeing bats fly around and all types of stuff, and parrots and everything. And she's floating all around the globe. And then next thing you know, she's floating up even higher, and she's seeing weather balloons, and she's waving at the space station. And she's waving at aliens. And she'd been up there for a couple of hours when she decided that she missed everybody there back in her hometown. So she decided to slowly start letting the air out. And she opened her mouth just a little bit, letting a tiny bit of air out at a time. And it starts coming out of the bubble. And even at this point, if everyone can't see how big it actually got, she decides that she wants to go back home to her small little hometown. She lets a little bit more air out, and she passes the space station again. And she passes the aliens, and she passes all the parrots and birds, and she passes everything else and the bats, and she comes back down through the clouds, slowly lowering herself down. And then all of a sudden, pop, the bubble goes pop, but she's still hundreds of feet above everybody in town, and she starts plummeting back down, and she lands square on the high bounce castle in the middle of the county fair. And she gets up, and she's covered in bubble gum, but the crowd cheers because she blew the biggest bubble ever.
And everyone cheered wildly. And she stood up, and she was a little shaken by all of this. I mean, it was exciting, right? She got to float up into the clouds, past the birds, past the space station. She saw aliens. She didn't know if anybody was going to believe her when she told them that. And it was a pretty incredible experience, and she felt like she had kind of seen it all, literally, and figured it. Like she felt accomplished in a way, that she had blown such a magnificent bubble, and she had seen all these amazing things, especially the aliens, because she always wondered about that. She would see things at night, things that might be UFOs in the sky, and she always kind of wondered about it. So at her age, it was nice to get some closure on that and some confirmation that was a thing. And she wasn't scared by it. She just thought it was kind of neat. And she felt like she really had an understanding of the world in a new way, because when you have a new perspective, and quite literally she had a 30,000-foot view of things, it changes you. And so she motioned over to Susie to bring her some wet naps, like a lot of wet naps, because it's like when you eat ribs and your fingers get sticky and you need something with some alcohol on it to clean it off. Well, she needed a lot of that to clean off the sticky gum. And Susie was so excited, she rushed over with the wet nap. She started to help clean Catherine up. And she said, "Oh my God, Catherine, that was so amazing. I can't wait to see what you're going to do next year." And Catherine looked at her, and she sighed, and she looked up at the heavens where she had just fallen from. And she looked back down at Susie and said, "You know what, Susie? I think this was my last bubble." And Susie looked really disappointed. She said, "That's okay, because it's time for me to pass that torch on to you." So she started training Susie for the next year.
And the next year, Susie came up to the podium, and she shoved 10 pieces of bubble gum into her tiny mouth, and she chewed, and the entire crowd didn't know if she'd be able to chew that much bubble gum, and she did. And then she took a breath off a balloon, and she started blowing into it. And the bubble got big, and the bubble got bigger, and the bubble got even bigger. And it got even bigger than Catherine's bubble had been the entire time, the year before. And it got huge. And suddenly Susie started motioning to people to come hold on to her. "Come hold on to me, everybody. Hold my hands." And Susie not only lifted herself off the ground, she took the entire town with her. And that town is still floating somewhere over France, I've heard. And maybe one day Susie will let them come down, but right now that entire town is seeing the world thanks to Catherine and her bubble blowing. The end. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Mandy. And Mandy lived in a normal house, in a normal suburbs, in a normal town. And Mandy thought that she had a completely normal life. But in her closet, in the very, very back, there was this tiny, tiny little door. Mandy asked her parents every couple of days, "Where does the tiny little door go?" And her parents always told her, "Oh, it just leads under the house. It's just there in case the pipes burst, in case we ever need to get under the house. It's just a hatch to get under the house." And it was sealed up, so Mandy couldn't open it. And so she forgot about it, and she just lived her life and played with her toys. And then one night she's laying in bed, and all of a sudden she hears a knocking. And Mandy gets up. She's like, where's that coming from? Is it my door? And she opens her door, and the house is pitch black. Mom and Dad are asleep, and she's all by herself. And so she goes and she gets back into bed. And then she hears it again. Knock, knock, knock. And she gets up, and she looks all around, and is it coming from under my bed? And she looks, and there's nothing under her bed, and she checks her windows. Knock, knock, knock. And then she realizes it's coming from the closet. And she opens up her closet, which is the scariest thing ever at night if you're a kid. But she slowly opens the closet, and the closet is empty. It's just her shoes and her board games and her toys and her clothes. But she hears it coming from the back. Knock, knock, knock. And she feels like that's where it's coming from. The back of her closet. Specifically, it's coming from the little door. There's something knocking on the other side of the little door. And Mandy slams the door and gets back into bed and pulls the covers up over her head, and she tries to forget about it, and eventually she goes to sleep. But then the next night, it happens again. Mandy's in bed, and she tries telling her parents about it, and her parents are like, it's just to underneath the house. There's nothing there. There's nothing that would knock. It's your imagination. And her parents turn off the lights and leave. And the next night, she tries to fall asleep, but as soon as her parents are in bed, Mandy starts hearing it again. And she gets up and she creeps over and she opens the closet door again, and the closet's completely normal. But coming from that tiny door on the other side of her closet, she hears knock, knock, knock. And so she doesn't know what to do, and she leans closer to it and presses her ear up to it, and she says, hello? And a voice echoes back, hello? And Mandy says, who are you? And the voice says, I'm trapped in here. You've got to let me out. And Mandy says, why don't you just crawl out? And the voice says, I can't. This door doesn't lead to the underside of your house. It leads to another dimension, and I'm trapped in here. I need you to let me out. And Mandy says, but who are you? And the voice says, I'm just a kid like you. I'm trapped. And Mandy is really scared. She doesn't know what to do. And so she crawls back into bed and pulls the covers up over her head, and she falls asleep. And then the next night, she tries to tell her parents again, and she says, there's a kid trapped in my closet on the other side of the wall, and it's another dimension. And her parents say, you are having some wild dreams. And they put her to bed again. And Mandy gets up in the middle of the night because once again, she is hearing knock, knock, knock. And she goes to her closet again, and it's just a normal closet, but there on the other side is that door and that hatch. And she hears the knocking again. And she starts talking to the voice again and says, why are you in there? And the voice says, I'm trapped. A witch has trapped me in here. And she says, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. And she starts trying to open up the door, but her parents have sealed it shut. And she starts pulling with all of her might, and the voice is pleading with her that there's a witch. And she tries and she pulls at it, and she doesn't know what to do. And so she goes back to bed, and the voice keeps saying, please, you have to help me. And so the next day, she hears it again at night. And again, she's tried to tell her parents, but her parents don't believe her. But tonight, she has a plan. She has a plan. She's got rulers. She's got all different types of toys from her room, and she is going to find a way to pry that door open. And so she waits to hear the knocking, and she waits, and her parents go to sleep, and it's forever, and she's just sitting there in darkness, and she's scared to death, and she's waiting to hear the knocking so she can help the kid on the other side of the wall. And suddenly she hears it again. Knock, knock, knock. And so she crits up and she creeps over to the closet, and she hears it again. Knock, knock, knock. And she calls out, hello, are you there? And she hears a voice answer back, yes, I'm here, but the witch is close. You've got to hurry. And Mandy jumps into it, and she starts trying to get that little door open, and she doesn't know what to do. And suddenly she does, and she opens it up, and she looks inside, and it's just darkness. She can't see anything, and she leans her head in slowly. Hello? And then suddenly she sees another little girl come barreling through running, and the little girl says, close it up quick, there's a witch on the other side. And Mandy doesn't know what to do, and then all of a sudden this witch hand shoots through the door and grabs her leg, and Mandy doesn't know what to do, so she shoves the door closed, and then she starts piling books up in front of the door, in front of the door, in front of the door, and she piles the books up and closes it as fast as she can, and on the other side she hears the witch howling that she can't get through. But Mandy has saved the little girl. And the little girl says that she actually lives in that town and that she was captured by the witch because she went through the door in her own closet. And so Mandy decides that she needs to seal up the closet, and the little girl goes home to do the same. The end.